You might think pirates spent most of their time leaping from ropes, brandishing cutlasses, shouting for glory, and digging holes for buried treasure. That's the image most of us carry, stitched together from stories, movies, and tall tales told across generations. But the truth is far less glamorous. Their most relentless enemy wasn't rival ships, storms, or even the powerful navies that hunted them across the seas. It was something simple, ordinary, and merciless: fresh drinking water. That might sound underwhelming at first, but imagine yourself out there, under the merciless sun, the sea stretching endlessly in every direction, and your only hope of survival sloshing around in a few wooden barrels that rotted, leaked, or turned sour far too quickly. Try telling a pirate choking on salty brine that fresh water wasn't a problem. They'd laugh, if they weren't too dehydrated to speak. Life at sea in the early 1700s, the golden age of piracy, had its fair share of adventure. But every adventure was haunted by the shadow of thirst. A typical pirate ship carried around 50 men. Each of those men needed close to a gallon of fresh water every single day, just to keep alive. That's 50 gallons every sunrise, 50 more every sunset. Add in cooking, cleaning, and the occasional need for mixing grog, and suddenly, the water demands of a ship spiraled into a monstrous figure. On a month-long voyage, they needed over 1,500 gallons of water, carefully stored in barrel after barrel, 63 of them, stacked wherever they would fit on a crowded wooden deck. At first glance, it sounds manageable, but the ocean has its own way of mocking human plans. Storing that much water on a swaying, leaking, humid wooden ship was no simple feat. It was a nightmare stitched together with mildew, sweat, and desperation. The barrels themselves were the first betrayal. Wooden casks were never perfect. They leaked, they split, they absorbed, and they invited unwelcomed guests. Under the tropical sun, water sitting in these containers turned foul, sour, and sometimes deadly. Mold crept along the insides. Invisible bacteria multiplied, feasting in the warmth. The taste grew so offensive that even men hardened by battle gagged as they drank. And yet, they had little choice. The alternative was worse. A man might think in his thirst that he could simply bend down and scoop up seawater. But seawater was no gift. With a salt content of nearly 3.5%, it didn't quench thirst, it magnified it. Drinking it was like pouring brine directly into your blood. The body rejected it at first, then yielded to it, leading to headaches, confusion, kidney failure, hallucinations, and eventually death. Pirates knew this, not through science, but through bitter experience. Many desperate sailors had tried, and many had perished, their last hours spent raving in fevered delirium as the seas swallowed their sanity. So why didn't they simply stop at ports, fill up their barrels, and move on? Sometimes they did, of course, but pirates rarely had such luxuries. More often they were hiding from naval patrols, pressed deep into the mid-Atlantic with no friendly harbor for thousands of miles. Other times the islands they stumbled upon betrayed them with brackish ponds or swamps crawling with worms and insects. Without purification methods, they had little way of knowing if the water they collected would save them or kill them. The idea of chemical treatments, filters, or boiling away impurities was centuries beyond their grasp. To them, water was a gamble, a cruel game of chance played with barrels and storms. Still, pirates were nothing if not resourceful. Desperation forced them to become reluctant engineers. They tinkered, experimented, and often failed in spectacular fashion. The barrels themselves were the first battlefield. Some tried lining the barrels with pitch, a tar-like material, to keep the water sealed. Others rubbed lime juice on the insides, hoping its acidity might stave off rot. In theory, it was clever. In practice, it left the water tasting like sour wood or rancid tar. One particularly disastrous attempt involved coating the inside of the barrels with animal fat to stop leaks. Instead, it created a greasy stew that attracted flies, dirt, and other uninvited filth. Picture a weary crew, lips cracked with thirst, forcing themselves to gulp down water that tasted of rotting bacon fat and sand. Their stomachs churned, Their morale plummeted, and mutiny whispered in the corners. Water could turn men against each other faster than gold ever could. When the barrels failed, pirates looked to the sky. Rainwater was pure, untouched by salt or rot, and storms were plentiful across the tropics. Crews would spread spare sails across the deck, angling them like makeshift funnels to catch every drop. In the middle of a downpour, men scrambled with buckets, cups, and open mouths, desperate to gather what they could. For a brief moment, the ship felt like a blessing, men laughing as they drank straight from the sky. But rain was unpredictable, and storms came when they pleased, often when pirates had no time to prepare. Worse, sails weren't meant to hold water. They soaked it in like sponges, carrying dirt, grime, and salt from the air, tainting the collection. What should have been a miracle often ended up tasting foul, yet still better than the festering swamp inside a barrel. Rainwater kept men alive, but it never came in enough quantity to sustain long voyages. It was a lottery, and pirates could never count on winning. Then came the more daring experiments. Some pirates turned to fire. By boiling seawater and capturing the steam, they could condense it into fresh drinking water, leaving the deadly salt behind. It was the rough ancestor of the desalination plants that power modern cities. The principle was simple, but execution was anything but. Ships had only so much fuel, and every plank of wood burned meant less to repair a mast or cook a meal. The rigs were fragile, prone to leaks, explosions, or collapse. Imagine a copper pot rigged above a galley fire, pipes snaking toward cool surfaces where droplets collected. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, one of the era's most feared pirates, is said to have ordered such a contraption built aboard his ship, the Royal Fortune. It could produce perhaps 10 gallons a day, enough to keep men alive, but not enough to satisfy 50 throats howling in thirst. Worse, the whole setup was as dangerous as it was ingenious. Fires erupted, pipes burst, and panicked sailors had to douse the chaos with buckets of the very seawater they were trying to purify. It was survival through trial, error, and no small amount of risk. Other crews learned that cooling water slowed the rot. They buried barrels in sand or wrapped them in wet cloths to keep them cooler under the blazing sun. It wasn't much, but every degree mattered. The cooler barrels bred bacteria more slowly, giving the water a fighting chance to stay drinkable. In the hot Caribbean, this was the closest thing they had to a refrigerator. The taste improved too. The saltiness muted ever so slightly. It wasn't fresh mountain spring water, but it was enough to keep men alive one more day, and one more day was often all that mattered. And yet, even with all these clever hacks, one flaw remained. Pirates never truly solved the problem of minerals, of electrolytes, of restoring what the body lost. Distilled water, lime juice, rum, and rainwater could keep them alive in the short term. But over months, men grew weaker. Their bones ached, their muscles cramped, and their minds dulled. They didn't know it, but they were prisoners of biology, trapped in a battle they could never fully win. Survival was measured not in comfort, but in days, in how long the crew could stagger forward before thirst or disease forced them to turn back or die where they stood. Still, when you imagine the pirate ship cresting a wave, sails billowing, black flags snapping in the wind, remember this. Beneath the bravado and violence, every man aboard was haunted by the same simple need: thirst. And thirst was the true enemy, as fierce as any naval gun. The weapons, the gold, the treasure chests. They were distractions from the quiet, endless war fought with barrels, sunlight, and whatever scraps of ingenuity they could muster. The next time you picture a pirate raising a mug in victory, imagine instead what might truly have been inside. Not foaming ale or golden rum, but a cup of water, thin, sour, precious, won through fire, sun, and sheer desperation. And even then, the fight wasn't over. Because on the horizon loomed new dangers, more desperate tricks, and the realization that the cruelest curse of the sea was not storms or enemies, but the thirst that never ended. The curse of thirst lingered like a shadow over every voyage, no matter how many tricks the pirates discovered. Even the best prepared ships, armed with stills, barrels, and citrus, eventually felt the creeping dread of empty casks and parched throats. And when all else failed, the sea itself seemed to mock them, surrounding them with endless water that promised only death if swallowed raw. But pirates were nothing if not resourceful, and desperation pushed them into even stranger, darker methods of survival. One such method was blood. When fresh water failed and rain refused to fall, there are accounts of men slaughtering turtles or seabirds, drinking their blood as a last resort. The fluid was salty, metallic, and nauseating, but it staved off thirst for a time. Some crews even cut the throats of sharks hauled on deck, collecting the blood in bowls, believing it to hold the strength of the predator. Others whispered of men so desperate they cut their own arms, licking the wounds for a taste of life. These were not the romantic images sung in tavern ballads. These were the hidden truths of piracy, the things sailors spoke of only in hushed tones, if at all. Survival often meant walking the line between human and beast. Then there were the stranger beliefs, the rituals that mixed superstition with survival. Some crews swore that tying knots in rope and soaking them in seawater, then squeezing them into the mouth, produced drops that felt fresher, as though the rope filtered away the salt. It was nonsense, of course, but men dying of thirst will cling to any hope. Others claimed that chewing on lead musket balls cooled their tongues, or that pressing hot irons into seawater could somehow purify it. These were illusions, desperate acts, born from a mind unraveling under the weight of thirst. Yet in rare cases, the placebo worked long enough to give men strength until real water could be found. How pirates turned seawater into drinking water for survival. In 1700, islands remained the greatest salvation. To sight green on the horizon was to feel life return to the deck. Pirates knew the tricks of the land as well as they knew the sea. They dug pits beneath coconut palms, letting water seep into the earth, cool and filtered. They cracked open coconuts by the hundreds, drinking the sweet liquid within, each nut a natural canteen. They carved vines, catching drips that ran down into their mouths. They learned which plants held moisture, which fruits quenched best, and which were poisonous traps. But reaching an island was no guarantee. Naval patrols knew pirates would make for land, and many a crew found themselves ambushed while gathering water, cut down on the very shore that might have saved them. Barrels, too, carried their own curse. Even when filled with the purest spring water at port, months at sea turned them sour. The wood swelled, cracked, and leaked. Salt spray seeped in. Slime grew along the staves. Worms, beetles, and even rats found their way inside. Sailors reported scooping out water crawling with larvae, straining it through cloth and drinking it anyway. They gagged, they retched, but they lived. Others added herbs, spices, or even gunpowder to disguise the stench, believing the powder's sulfur and charcoal could cleanse it. Some captains ordered their men to plunge red-hot cannonballs into barrels, claiming the heat would kill the rot. Whether it worked or not hardly mattered. Belief itself kept men drinking, and drinking kept them alive. Over time, the pirates' crude methods hinted at truths that science would one day confirm. Their solar stills foreshadowed modern desalination plants. Their lime rations laid the foundation for the British Navy's battle against scurvy. Their experiments with algae and mangroves echoed the principles of modern biofiltration. They were outlaws, thieves, killers, but also accidental innovators, men whose survival instincts dragged them into discoveries long before scholars could put names to them. What universities and governments would later perfect in laboratories, pirates had stumbled upon out of sheer necessity, driven by the most primal of human needs. Yet even with all their cunning, survival was never guaranteed. Many ships vanished without a trace, their crews withering under the sun, barrels dry, tongues swollen, eyes glassy as madness set in. Others limped into port, gaunt and broken, their once proud flags hanging in tatters, men too weak to raise their swords. The sea was merciless, and thirst was its sharpest weapon. Gold could be buried, ships could be rebuilt, but a man who lost the fight against thirst was gone forever. That was the unspoken truth of piracy. Behind every raid, every cannon blast, every tale of buried treasure, lay weeks of quiet, brutal war against the invisible enemy of the sea. And still, they endured. For every ship that fell, another rose, sails patched, barrels filled anew. Men ready to gamble their lives once more. Thirst might break bodies, but it could not break the spirit of those who chose freedom over chains, danger over safety. They learned, they adapted, and they carried their secrets forward, passing them from deck to deck, generation to generation, until they became the hidden lore of the sea. So the next time you hear the word pirate, don't picture only the flashing cutlass or the glittering chest of stolen gold. Picture instead the sun beating down on a deck, men crouched over a fragile still of glass and wood, waiting for drops of ghost water to fall. Picture the barrels, stinking and slimy, yet guarded like treasure. Picture the cracked lips, the whispered prayers for rain, the mad experiments with plants, blood, and fire. For in the end, the true story of piracy is not only about greed and violence, but about survival. About men who faced an ocean that offered them nothing, and still found ways to live. And perhaps that is their greatest legacy. Not the plunder, not the terror they spread, but the stubborn, relentless will to endure against odds that seemed impossible. They were ruthless, they were clever, they were forgotten. But in the silent war against thirst, pirates carved out a victory that history rarely tells. And that victory, though born of desperation, carried them across oceans, through storms, and into legend. Of course, pirates being pirates, they sometimes tried to cheat. They flavored the water, adding rum, citrus peels, or herbs in a desperate attempt to disguise the rot. For a time, it lifted spirits, but soon the citrus decomposed, foaming into a foul, acidic swamp the men dubbed Pirate Punch. It was a cruel joke. Half-rotten water dressed up like a festival drink, and the price was stomach cramps, vomiting, and misery. Rum itself was a strange ally. Too much, and it dehydrated the men faster, dulling their senses when they needed them sharp. But a little, mixed with water, killed some bacteria and masked the worst of the taste. Pirates rationed rum carefully, treating it like medicine as much as morale. But it was a dangerous game. Too much tipped the crew into drunken chaos. Too little, and despair settled over the deck like fog. The fight for water was never-ending, relentless, and merciless. Every trick bought them time, but never safety. And yet, from these desperate experiments came flashes of brilliance, moments when pirates stumbled by chance or necessity onto the very edge of science. They didn't know the chemistry, the biology, or the physics. But they learned, slowly, painfully, what worked and what didn't. They became accidental inventors, crafting crude versions of techniques that would one day fuel industries, navies, and even nations. To stay alive, they had to become more than marauders. They had to become engineers of survival. And just when it seemed they'd reached the limits of their ingenuity, they stumbled onto a method that would change everything. One that harnessed the most abundant force of all, the sun itself. A method that turned salt water into fresh and misery into hope. But that discovery, like all things at sea, came not from careful planning, but from an accident, a broken pot, and the curiosity of men too desperate to give up. The accident that sparked the next great leap in pirate survival began with something as simple as a pot of water left too long under the sun. A broken shard of glass had fallen from a skylight and settled on top, creating a crude cover. Hours later, the crew discovered that the water beneath the glass seemed less salty, clearer, and strangely easier to drink. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to spark an idea. In that moment, pirates unknowingly brushed against the science of evaporation and condensation, a principle that would later revolutionize water treatment around the world. What they had stumbled upon was the birth of the solar still, the simplest desalination device imaginable, powered only by sunlight and desperation. Word of this discovery spread from ship to ship, carried by whispers, rumors, and the occasional drunken boast in a port tavern. Crews began experimenting with shallow pans filled with seawater, covered with broken panes of glass, salvaged lantern covers, or even thin sheets of oiled cloth. Under the relentless tropical sun, the water would slowly evaporate, rise as vapor, and condense on the underside of the cover. Drops slid down, collected in grooves or cups, and dripped into waiting containers as drinkable, if oddly tasteless, fresh water. It was far from efficient. A pan might yield only a few pints a day, sometimes less. But to men living on the knife's edge of thirst, even a pint meant survival. They called it ghost water, born from the sea and the sun, invisible until it slid down into their cups like a gift from nowhere. Pirates didn't understand the chemistry, of course. To them, it was a miracle, a trick of nature they could exploit. But they refined it nonetheless, adjusting the angle of the glass, the depth of the pan, even blackening the bottoms to absorb more heat. Over time, they built fragile, makeshift rigs out of salvaged wood, copper pots, and scavenged windows. They guarded them fiercely, for these contraptions often meant the difference between life and death. Some reports even suggest that Captain Edward Lowe's crew experimented with multiple stills lined across the deck, turning their ship into a floating forest of dripping glass panels. Sailors joked that their vessel looked less like a pirate ship and more like a greenhouse drifting across the sea, but the results were undeniable. With each passing day, fewer men collapsed from thirst, and morale, fragile as it was, held together. The irony of the solar still was that it worked too well. The water it produced was pure, stripped of every mineral. At first it seemed a blessing, soft on the tongue, and free of the swampy taste that haunted barrels. But within days, men began complaining of strange headaches, dizziness, and a gnawing hunger that no meal seemed to satisfy. Distilled water, lacking the natural salts and minerals found in springs and rivers, slowly drained the body of what it needed most. The pirates didn't know why, but they felt it. Some scribbled in journals about ghost water that made their breath taste strange, or how their bodies craved salty foods more than usual. Yet even with these side effects, it was far safer than drinking straight from the ocean or rotting casks. Pirates were never picky when survival was on the line. They drank, they endured, and they lived. It wasn't just the stills that kept them alive. In quieter moments, when ships anchored near coasts or drifted lazily along warm shallows, pirates began experimenting with another peculiar method: living filters. They placed aquatic plants, algae, and even mangrove roots inside barrels of water, hoping the greenery would absorb the filth and leave the water fresher. It was crude biology, the earliest echo of what modern aquariums and wastewater plants would later perfect. The plants consumed waste, released oxygen, and in some cases, improved the clarity of the water. But for ships resting near islands, it offered an alternative to the endless scraping and scrubbing of barrels. Captain Henry Morgan's men were said to be fond of this trick, harvesting moss and mangrove shoots to fashion floating gardens that bobbed alongside their ship. The smell wasn't always pleasant, but when desperation reigned, even foul-smelling water was better than none. But not every attempt at survival was rooted in cleverness. Often pirates fell back on their most faithful companion, rum. Stronger than most modern spirits, it was diluted with whatever water they had on hand, creating grog that could mask foul flavors and, in some cases, kill bacteria. Rum lifted spirits, steadied nerves, and numbed the misery of the endless voyage. Yet it was a double-edged sword. Too much, and men grew reckless, stumbling on deck, useless in battle or navigation. Too little, and despair crept in, leaving them muttering curses at their captains or whispering mutiny. Rationing rum was as delicate as steering through reefs, and many a captain found that the measure of his command lay not in gold or guns, but in the careful balance of liquor and water. Citrus, too, became an unlikely hero. Pirates discovered that lime juice, carried in barrels or mixed with water, did more than just sour the taste. It slowed the rot in barrels, its acidity cutting down bacterial growth. It also fought scurvy, the sailor's plague that rotted gums and stole strength from even the bravest crews. To drink lime juice straight was vile, a sourness described as worse than spoiled milk, but mixed with rum or rancid water, it became tolerable, sometimes even invigorating. Captain Woodes Rogers, who patrolled the Caribbean in the early 18th century, was known to insist on lime rations for his men. The practice spread slowly, creeping from ship to ship, pirate and navy alike, until citrus became as vital to survival as powder and shot. Piece by piece, pirates built a survival system out of desperation. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't consistent, and it often bordered on madness, but it worked just enough. A combination of distillation rigs, buried barrels, algae gardens, lime rations, and the occasional rum-flavored gamble allowed ships to stretch their voyages longer than anyone thought possible. Some historians argue that this was the true reason piracy flourished in the Caribbean and Atlantic for so long, not because of superior tactics or fearsome reputations, but because pirates, through endless trial and error, learned how to keep themselves alive where others failed. For every flashy raid or treasure haul, there were weeks of quiet struggle against thirst, barrels, and the slow rot of the sea.